I can remember when we had nothing in this country. That's how young I am. So it gives me immense pleasure to stand up here and just get the view that I have now. This would have been a dream, a different kind of American dream. But we knew that we could build an international, including in this country. And that's because we have the ideas with which we can build a powerful organization that can lead the working class on a global scale. Now, if any of you does anybody here desire a nice, peaceful, quiet life? No. Well, I do. And that's why I'm here. I hope that one day I will have one, having achieved what we gave ourselves the task of achieving. But if you wanted a quiet life, obviously you're in the wrong place and in the wrong time. The stability of the past is well and truly gone, and we're living through a change in epoch. And the young ones here are the lucky ones because you got a lot more time ahead of you to achieve what we've given ourselves as a target. Now, in the recent In Defense of Marxism magazine, we published an article by Ted Grant written at the end of the Second World War. It's called The Changed Relationship of Forces in Europe and the Role of the Fourth International. I'm sure some of you will have read that. If you haven't, I advise you to read it. The reason we published that magazine, although it's called 1945, is because it has a lot of lessons for today. Although the way the balance of forces changed was different, it was a key turning point, and we are living through a major turning point in world history. That is evident by everything that we see today. Now, we need to learn from history, not simply because we've got to do exams at school or university and answer the questions. That's not the way we study history. It's to get a sense of history, a sense of the rhythm of the class struggle throughout history, and a sense of what is brewing below the surface today. Because if you have a historical view of events, you can see ahead what could be coming based on the contradictions of the moment, and not limit yourselves to a superficial view, such as many on the left and many even commentators do today. We understand that the working class can tolerate much. It can take a lot, as long as a minimum of a civilized existence is guaranteed. But there are key moments in history when the accumulated contradictions and the anger suddenly change the situation. And it seems like a sudden change that came from nowhere. But if you're a Marxist and you've studied history and you've studied the contradictions of the system, it doesn't come as a surprise. You've actually been waiting for it. You've been expecting it. We can't say exactly when, but we know big events are coming. Now, usually, when we produce a World Perspectives document, the tradition was that we'd start discussing it in the International Secretariat around about October, November. By December, we'd hope to get a draft, translate it, get it to the IEC by January, discuss it, amend it, send it to the sections. And by the time it gets voted on, it's August. Now, just imagine if we'd done that this year. What would be missing from the document? Well, I don't know, Trump wins the elections and the tariffs, the fall of Assad. I don't know how many other things would be missing from the document. All the events in Europe, the elections in Germany, etc., 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 the ongoing Ukraine war. It's actually, we had to adapt to the situation. Big events are taking place, and so we've had to do it in a shorter time span. The draft will be discussed throughout the international and then finally discussed and voted on at the World Congress. Now, where do we start? We could start with the new Pope. He's one of you guys. And I can say it in Sicilian, Americano. But I have some things to say, even on that, because it is of significance, even though it might not seem the case. We could discuss the Ukraine war, Gaza, the renewed offensive, the ceasefire, the breaking of the ceasefire, the negotiations for a new ceasefire, the ongoing butchery of thousands of Palestinians. We could start with the tariff wars, the ups and downs, the instability that this is producing, the rise of the populist right, the debt crisis, difficulties facing the ruling class of Germany, a key country, the crisis in France, the situation with Le Pen, the incredible mass movements in Greece, Serbia, Turkey, and many other countries, the recent India-Pakistan conflict, the two armies that were facing each other, 660,000 strong Pakistan military, and the Indian, which is twice the size, or the nuclear powers that those two countries are, 160 to 170 nuclear warheads each, that if they were ever used, would cause devastation across the whole of the South Asian continent. The involvement of China in the war, in the sense that you see that how complicated and contradictory the situation is. Pakistan has historically been close to China, and China has provided much of the hardware for its military, but the big market is in India, and China cannot afford to alienate India. You see how complicated the situation is becoming, and the reason for all this is the world market, which is not big enough to accommodate all the powers, and therefore the criteria that determines the thinking of major powers is always, in the last analysis, connected to this question. Now, I just wanted to quote something, and I want you to guess where it comes from. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. And then it continues. So supposedly said the revolutionary leader, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. The diplomatic whirlwind that has surrounded US President Donald Trump this week suggests the old Bolshevik might have been onto something. Can anyone guess where that article comes from? It's the BBC, the source of Bolshevik propaganda. But it's a serious article, and the reason the reason I'm quoting is this: Lenin was right, and it's significant that an article from the BBC talking about all the turbulence and the acceleration of the process starts by quoting Lenin's famous phrase, because what he said is absolutely relevant to what is happening today. In any discussion like this, it's always important to go back to basics and not forget the basic underlying elements that determine what is happening. Capitalism is a system based on the profit motive. That's what drives the system. Capital seeks to constantly increase itself. It needs to grow and expand. And it has a logic of its own. Now, I'm not saying capital thinks. Humans think, and it's humans who want the capital to grow. But once it appears as a phenomenon in history, its desire is to increase the profit, increase itself, strengthen itself. And it has a logic of its own, which you cannot manipulate. That's the problem the reformists have. They think that with such a system, driven by such a motive, they can actually tinker with it and improve the lives of working people without abolishing the system itself. And competition over markets is at the heart of the system. And the thing is this, of course, in this process, there are winners and there are losers. There are imperialist powers and colonies and neo-colonies. There are dominating countries and dominated. And in this process, over a long period, there are conflicts between the powers, with some rising and some falling. We've seen that throughout history. We have periods of relative stability, followed by sudden changes when things come into line with all the accumulated contradictions that were developing in the previous period. In this, of course, we have the nation states, which remain one of the key obstacles to the development of productive forces, and these tend to defend, of course, the interests of their own national bourgeoisies, which explains the conflict. Now, all I've done here is repeat basic Marxist understanding, but if you understand these basic points, you can understand what's happening in the world. To all of this process, of course, we apply the laws of dialectical materialism, the methods of the scientific method of Marxism, and one of the laws I'm sure you all discussed in your branches, in your reading groups, etc., the transformation of quantity into quality. The long-term quantitative changes accumulate over time, and at a certain point, they produce a leap. We are living through such a leap. What we're living through today is the accumulation of factors that have piled one on top of another over the last few decades. And what we're living through are epoch-changing events. I just quoted the India-Pakistan conflict, which was just one more example of the instability. But what comes out of that little event, you could call it, compared, I suppose, to the potential bigger conflicts, are the positions of the so-called communists, the CPI and the CPIM. What did they do? They supported their own bourgeoisie. They call themselves communists. They behaved like the social democracy in 1914. So, comrades, we have a big job to reconquer the real meaning of what it means to be a communist, and why Lenin insisted on adopting that name and abandoning the term social democracy, because it had become a stinking shirt. Now, I'll skip over that. I do want to say something about the Pope. That's not because I was brought up a Catholic, but you know, I had my communion, confession, and all the other sacraments that go with it. But it is an interesting little detail. You see, today, how many of you have seen people on the left who say what a great Pope Francis was? He spoke about Gaza. He spoke about Ukraine. He talked about peace. And I've seen so-called communists praising him and quoting him. The leader of Rifondazione Comunista, which is a party in complete state of collapse and decline, what's left of the old Communist Party in Italy, when he was accused of being a Putin supporter because he was against the war, he said, "I'm not with Putin, I stand with Pope Francis." This is a so-called communist. I'd like to quote a genuine communist. And this is what this genuine communist said. "The Vatican is an international enemy of the revolutionary proletariat. It is clear that the Italian working class must resolve the problem of the papacy in large part with its own hands. But it is equally clear that this goal cannot be achieved unless the international proletariat also rises to the occasion." Now that is a communist. That was Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist who knew what he was talking about. But why? Why do some of the communists today, so-called communists, have this approach? Well, you see, there may be some superficial differences, but fundamentally, the thinking of the reformists and the approach of the Vatican under a pope like we have today is fundamentally the same, i.e., they don't want the overthrow of the system, they don't want the abolition of private property per se, but they want some reforms that can soften the relations between the classes. And it is significant that this pope has taken on the name of Leo XIV. There's a lot of Leos in history, as you can see. But there was the previous one, Leo XIII, and he was the pope also in an interesting period. He was the pope of the latter part of the 19th century. Now, in 1891, he issued an encyclical called the Rerum Novarum, or The Rights and Duties of Capital and Labour. Did you know the Pope deals with such matters? But it was an open letter on the condition of the working class. I prefer to read another book on the condition of the working class by a guy called Engels. But the Pope then, he defends workers' rights and wages, but makes an appeal to the bosses to improve conditions for the workers. In the same document, they reject socialism, state ownership, and they attack savage capitalism at the same time. But also, they make a strong point to defend the rights of private property, and attacks the atheistic Marxists. Now, why did they spend so much time writing this? Well, you see, this was issued in 1891. In 1889, the Second International had just been founded as an international organization of the working class based on the ideas of Marxism. And in Germany, it was a mass force. Marxist ideas had spread throughout the labor movement internationally. Mass workers' organizations based on the ideas of Marxism were developing, and they felt that this was a threat to the capitalist system. Therefore, the Pope paid a lot of attention and tried to use, let's say, the authority of the church to soften the class struggle, i.e., defend the rights of workers to have better wages, etc., but push towards class compromise rather than revolution and the overthrow of the system. Therefore, I do think that this Pope, the name he's given himself, is relevant to the role they'd like to play. But history also isn't wasted. Over 100 years of history have damaged somewhat the Catholic Church, as you will be aware. And its authority is not the same as it was. But that's the case if you look at because the church is a pillar of bourgeois society, just as the education system is, just as the media are, such as the so-called democratic institutions of the state, the parliaments, etc. These are all pillars of state of bourgeois society, whose aim it is to maintain the stability of the system, avoid its overthrow, and govern society. The fact that these institutions are not as authoritative as they were is an indication of the rottenness of the system, and you can sense it at all levels of society. And I suppose the fact that he's American, maybe they think that they need an American Pope in America, where the class struggle is brewing and the class contradictions are growing. But enough on the Pope. It's clear that the end of the post-war equilibrium, that equilibrium which Ted Grant referred to in that article in 1945, that new balance of forces, which basically saw the world divided between two major powers, massive, powerful US imperialism and this massively strengthened Soviet Union. That post-war equilibrium is very clearly has broken down. Even NATO, that huge military alliance which emerged from that period, is now put into question. I have here a nice little picture of the world, which is presented like, I suppose, some kind of pumpkin pie. And you've got three leaders, Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin, carving it up into three nice big chunks. And that's the Financial Times comment on the situation. You see, the relations between the powers have changed as the world economy has entered into crisis. And it's quite clear those with the muscle are using it. China has been massively strengthened, and I'll give some figures on that. Russia has been strengthened militarily, and the US is still, although relatively in decline, is still the major power. Now, all this was going on long before Trump was elected. It's not as if suddenly now the Europeans think, some of them think, that America is becoming an enemy. These are the words that have appeared in the Financial Times by serious commentators. this was going on before. It's ironic to see the left on this, and the reformists, when they talk about lesser evilism, that somehow Biden was better. And I think, well, are you blind to what Biden did to Europe with the Ukraine war? The Europe has been enormously weakened further to what it had already been suffering before by the Ukraine war. The German economy has been devastated, and this was all thanks to our nice, friendly allies under Biden. And now they claim that everything's getting bad because of this new guy that's in the White House. The European situation is a critical one. Europe is under enormous pressure. This is the center of, historically, the center of world imperialism. The great imperialist powers of the past. Britain was the number one, together with France, Germany, and a few others. Now Europe has been enormously reduced in its influence globally, and America has been squeezing Europe for some time. I've quoted this before in other meetings, but an article here from Foreign Policy that talks about a window of opportunity now exists for Washington, as in 1945, to bend Europe. And it goes on. This was long before Trump was elected. It even says the United States should use the threat of withdrawing from NATO. This wasn't Trump. This was before. There's clearly a thinking of the American ruling class that relations have to change with the Europeans. And they've been squeezing Europe massively. I'll come back to that in a minute. The bourgeois media is extremely worried about what's happening. Just one headline of The Economist from early April. Trump's trade war threatens a global recession. Investors are worried. Later, the same article points out that there's a likelihood of a global recession this year. J.P. Morgan Chase now puts the chances at 60%. And then the comment on, was it Liberation Day? That was what he called it, wasn't it? It's an interesting little comment from The Economist. It says, how would you describe the past week? This is early April. Crazy? Unsettling? We opted for Ruination Day to sum up Donald Trump's disastrous tariff announcements. This is the gloomy, pessimistic view of the bourgeois in the present situation. Now, there are historical precedents which we can look at. Now, as Marxists, we study history to draw out the lessons in order to understand today. We should also be careful not to seek absolute parallels and sort of magic formulas which explain everything, because there have been changes. 80 years of history since the Second World War, the powerful post-war boom, the changes that have been produced in the relations between the powers have also created a situation which is unprecedented in history. And therefore, history is useful, but we also have to look at the new elements in the situation. And it's interesting how the bourgeois themselves also try and do this. There's an article from the Financial Times, 11th of May, that refers to the 19th century concert of Europe. And now, it's not somebody playing a violin. It's the concert of Europe is a reference to the arrangement which was made in Europe after, from the Congress of Vienna, 1814-15, basically post-Napoleonic Europe, the agreements they made between the major powers to avoid another war, to have relatively peaceful relations, and so they could all get on making their profits. And for about 100 years, it worked. It didn't end too well in 1914. That was the end of that period. But so long as it lasted, there was this relative equilibrium. What broke that equilibrium was fundamentally the unification of Germany in 1871. Italy was also united, but didn't quite play the same role. And subsequently, the massive development of productivity of the German economy. The industrialization of Germany, in a certain sense, it has certain parallels with China, in the sense that the massive development of Chinese industry, the huge development of productivity in China, is the key element in determining the changed balance of forces today and the relative decline of the US. In that period, the unification of Germany, the industrialization of Germany, the massive investment in industry, and productivity in Germany in that period, 1871 to 1914, was growing at something like double the rate that it was growing in Britain. That shows you where it was going. Looking at things like that can help you and have an idea what is going to happen. The productivity cannot grow at that pace in one country relative to others without consequences at some point. And the rise of Germany meant that it was becoming a major industrial power, and at some point would have to challenge the other powers for control of sectors of the market. This powerful industrial apparatus of Germany needed an outlet. It needed exports. It needed a market which was dominated by other powers. We know how it ended. Now, I'm not saying this is going to end in the Third World War, but that's not excluded in the long run. We do not say that Third World War is ruled out forever. What we say is it's not the immediate perspective. But in the long run, that is the barbarism that this system could produce. And you can see how that is a possible outcome. Now, whether that becomes the outcome or not depends on the working class having a leadership which is capable of leading it to change society and remove the factors that would lead to such a disastrous outcome. This question of productivity is a key element in understanding what is happening. European productivity in the last 40 years has stagnated. It has slowed down to almost zero. It's barely 1% maybe in the recent period. That explains the decline of Europe. The productivity of the United States, although low relative to China, is still about double what it is in Europe. And then we have the Chinese development, of course. Now, this is worrying the serious strategists of capital in Europe. I don't know if you've heard of a guy called Draghi. He was the governor of the European Central Bank and then later became Prime Minister of Italy. He wrote a report, it's known as the Draghi Report, and he says that the Europeans must find 800 billion euros a year extra for investment. That is a huge amount of capital that has to be found. And the problem is this. In theory, yes, you could invest if you had the money, if you didn't have the huge debts they've got. But you've got to convince individual capitalists to invest. You see, we still live in a society based on private property. And if you own the property, you decide what you do with it. And he can complain till the cows come home. Now, this question of productivity and investment, why invest when you can't use the productive capacity that you have? That's one of the key problems they're facing. Now, I've got the figures here for the US, but also other countries. It's a graph which is obviously, you can't see it from here, it's too, but I can. What it shows is, this is the United States, but it's not just the United States. Since 1970, up till, these are figures up until this year, utilization of productive capacity has gone from nearly 90% down to about 77% in the United States. In Europe, it's a similar figure. It's about 77%. In China, it's about 76%. Now, this means they have much greater capacity to produce than they can actually use, i.e., they can't sell the goods that they could make. So you have the phenomenon of overproduction, which in today's world is expressed also as overcapacity, i.e., you don't use the capacity if you can't sell the goods. Now, why would capitalists then invest in massively increasing productive capacity if that's the situation. And the problem is, of course, is that the market isn't there. It's not sufficient. Now, this brings out some of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism that Marx explained. And sooner or later, this contradiction plays itself out as a major crisis in the system. That is what we're living through. But Europe is going through a particularly severe crisis. An article from Financial Times last year, the title is "Capitalism is in Worse Shape in Europe," and it refers precisely to this question of productivity and the decline of Europe. Compare all this to China, where if you look at China's growth in productivity, and I have the figures from 2013 until last year, productivity in that period has grown by roughly 6% a year. As you can see, much, much higher than in the United States and in Europe. That is what is at the heart of a major conflict globally today, fundamentally between the relatively declining US imperialist power and the rising Chinese power. Now, it's in this situation that you have the Trump phenomenon. Now, I'm not going to go into Trump too much because I thought maybe this is the one section where people should know a little bit more about this phenomenon. But we've written about it in the International. We've produced articles. You have a US Perspectives document. I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. But it's interesting. Sometimes a necessity is expressed through accident. Engels, in a letter in 1894, he says, "Necessity, which is supplemented by and appears under the forms of accident." But then, of course, that accident is not really an accident. It's an expression of a necessity. And this necessity is what? A realization that there's been a change in the balance of forces globally. US imperialism cannot be the policeman of the world. That is the realization. It doesn't have the power relative to others to do that. It can't just go all around the world telling people what to do. They have to pull back and defend their core interests. And this is an important element in the understanding of the US administration today. And it's not therefore just one crazy guy, as the European media like to present it. It's actually the thinking of a serious section of the US ruling class, i.e., we have to look at our core interests. We can't look after everybody else. And that explains the position of the US on the Ukraine war. There's a significant section of the ruling class has drawn the conclusion this war is not of our interest. It's not defending our core interests. Biden thought that they could hit China by weakening Russia. They've had the opposite effect, and I'll give some figures in a minute. But the change in balance of forces is from 1945, as I said. You had the two major powers, which created a kind of equilibrium on a global scale. It didn't stop all the wars. I mean, Vietnam and Korea and many, many others took place. But there was a relative peace between the major powers, let's put it that way. In 1991, the internal contradictions of the Soviet Union, which had been predicted by Marxists, led to the collapse of that superpower and the emergence of one single superpower. And they did, I think, delude themselves for a period that we're number one, we've won. It hid, they were not looking at the real underlying process, which was the relative slow, long-term decline of US imperialism. If you compare what happened during the Second World War, if you look at the amount of capital that was accumulated, the capital was doubled in the United States in the process of the Second World War. Productivity during the Second World War grew by 26% in this country. The other side of that equation is that wages of workers grew by 0.6%. So there was a massive concentration of capital in the hands of the capitalist class. And they would have liked to continue with that. Unfortunately for them, it was actually the American working class that said, no, 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 the war is finished. We want to get paid. And you saw the biggest strike wave in the history of this country. But that huge accumulation of capital also explains why the US was able to play the role that it did. It could use that capital to stabilize Western Europe, stabilize Japan, and try and establish its position globally. Since then, of course, we've seen the decline. I'm not going to go into the details. There's lots of graphs which show how the different percentages of GDP in the hands of different powers has shifted. The US has lost a huge amount. China has massively increased. At the same time, as we have, I'll refer to China in a minute, we have the recovery of Russia. Now, Russia, in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and losing all of the former republics and having to retreat to the borders of Russia itself, went through a cataclysmic decline in the 90s. We compared it to the kind of collapse you'd see in a war, something like 60% collapse in GDP. But it has recovered since then. It has recovered everything it has lost and has grown beyond that. I have all the graphs here which show that absolutely clearly. Russia has recovered economically. By the way, that also explains the popularity of Putin in Russia. He embodies the period of the recovery, and people identify that. The period of the declining, for instance, you look at the expected life expectancy in Russia, which went down, has recovered. All kinds of factors can show the improvement for ordinary people in that period. Now, we're not saying that he solved the fundamental contradictions of capitalism and that Russia will not have its problems. It will. All capitalist countries have their contradictions. But that is the process it's gone through. Combined with that, we have the military strengthening of Russia. And it's rather funny. I was looking at an article yesterday, actually, in the BBC. In the course of this war, since this war started, Russia has made close to $1 trillion from the sale of fossil fuels. And they're complaining, these are the liberals, they're complaining that Russia has made 3 times the money that the West gave the Ukrainians in aid for war. And they're explaining that, well, you see, the problem is the Europeans themselves are buying the Russian oil. Sometimes it's disguised. They don't buy the crude oil, they buy the refined oil. But the original crude oil that was refined came from Russia. And people like India and others help in this process while they make money from it. They're complaining, but it also points out that they're in a trap, because if they really did cut off all that oil, it would worsen their own position even more. Now, just to give some the graphic picture of the decline of Europe, which also affects the political situation there. In 1980, European Union represented something like 30% of world GDP. So it was a major economic force. By 2020, this had gone down to 15%, a halving of its presence in the global economy, while Russia has recovered and China has emerged as a major power. This decline of Europe is going to have a huge impact on the class struggle in Europe. And sometimes you look at the behavior of political leaders like Starmer, like Macron, and like all the others, or von der Leyen, this wonderful lady that leads the European Union, or that lovely young lady, as your president calls her, that Italian woman, Meloni. The behavior of these people, from a logical point of view of the core interest, you would think it's absolutely crazy the way they're behaving. They're pushing for this war to be stepped up, to be continued. They're pushing for more arms to be sent to the Ukraine. Now, under pressure from America, they've realized they can't count on America. They're being forced to start discussing rearmament on a huge scale, which would mean shifting resources towards military expenditure precisely in the moment when the working class of Europe have suffered one of the biggest cutbacks in their standard of living and the biggest attacks on social spending like healthcare, education, and so on, to the degree that we have countries like Britain now spending more on interest rate than they are spending on healthcare or on education, such as the debt. But if we look at Germany, now Germany was at the heart of the European Union. The European Union, in effect, was Germany's backyard. It was its market. That's why Germany is so keen on the European Union, because it needs this massive market. You see, if you look at the question of exports, Germany, of all the powers, is heavily dependent on exports. It exports something like 40% of its GDP. That means it needs a much bigger market than its home market can provide. But it's suffered massively as a consequence of the Ukraine war. For example, the cost of energy for German industry is about 3 times what it is in the United States or China. Therefore, its competitive edge has been really eaten into, and that is now reflected in German society. I just want to quote the president of the German Bosses Association. It's called the DHIK. This is what he says: too little investment, too much bureaucracy, and excessively high location costs. The German economy is stuck. Further, then he goes on and says, we are not only facing a cyclical, but a persistent structural crisis in Germany. He continues to talk about a structural crisis, a solid structural crisis, high costs of energy and personnel, now compounded by geopolitical uncertainties and a decline in domestic and foreign demand. And he ends, we need deep reforms now as well. And he's referring to the 2010, it's called the Agenda 2010 reforms. By the way, have you noticed how language changes too? When I was young, reform meant something very different. A reform meant a better health service. Today, the reform of the NHS means its practical elimination. But when he says we need deep reforms now as well, what they're saying is we need to attack the German working class. It says, if Europe doesn't take decisive steps to reduce regulation, economic recovery will remain elusive. And he's talking about not just Germany, but Europe as a whole. What they're saying is, faced with this massive decline of Europe, its reduction in its role in the global economy and the world situation, they need clearly to strengthen their economy, but the only way the capital can think of strengthening itself is at the cost of the working class, i.e., by reducing the cost of labor in order to maximize the extraction of surplus value for the capitalist class. By doing that, they are destabilizing Europe. Now, the Ukraine war, I haven't got time to go into the details of it. The Ukraine war has not gone according to plan. I think you'll have noticed that. They were hoping, this was the crazy thinking they had there, that by forcing a war on Russia, they would massively weaken Russia, bleed it, and even possibly break it up. They were discussing that kind of thing. Weakening Russia, through Russia, they could then go for China. A complete miscalculation, a misunderstanding of the position of Russia. Russia has strengthened its position. Economically, it has been growing instead of entering crisis. And it has massively increased its military power. It's actually got stronger. And they're looking at defeat in the Ukraine. You'd wonder why the Europeans are insisting on this. Now, you see, in politics, prestige does play a role. You see, if you are a powerful imperialist power, you can make deals, contracts. You can go around the world and you have weight when you go and negotiate with the countries. If you are like the French, you've been squeezed out of Africa by the Russians and militarily, and the Chinese in terms of financial pressure. When Germany has been weakened massively in its influence in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, their prestige is not worth what it used to be. That is an important element in the thinking of the Europeans. You'd think they'd gone crazy. From an objective, purely objective point of view, some of what they're doing is absolutely crazy, but there's a logic to it, and it explains the behavior of Starmer and Macron and all the others. All they're doing, however, is further exacerbating the contradictions inside Europe. This is creating political crisis after political crisis. Britain, for example. You saw last year, after 14 years of the Tories in government, who became hated by the masses, their vote collapsed. Labour won what seems to be a massive landslide victory. But be careful. We look closer, get the magnifying glass and look a bit closer, and you'll see that it wasn't a landslide victory in the sense it was not a massive surge in votes. They won with 34% in the elections. I remember in the 70s, Labour with such a vote would massively lose the elections. I remember they lost an election with 38%. They won because of the political system the way it is, because first past the post, the division of votes between the parties, but also because something like 40% didn't vote, because they can't see an alternative worth voting for. And if you actually calculate the votes that Labour got as a percentage of the total electorate, only 20% of the British people actually voted for Starmer. And now that would probably be even less. I've never seen the popularity of a prime minister plummet so quickly. Within 1 year, if they had elections today, Labour would massively lose the elections. And that's 1 year. Why? Well, because whoever comes to government in this system cannot carry out those reforms that the Pope might be hoping they carry out in order to soften the class struggle, or the reformists dream of. They have to carry out the dictates of capital. With such a huge debt and such huge debt repayment, they cannot afford to spend money on genuine reforms. So what did Starmer do when he came in? Well, one of the first things he did, now in Britain, in the past, they introduced what's called the winter fuel allowance, which was an extra 300 or so pounds in the winter for the pensioners, the poor pensioners, because people were so scandalized by the fact that because of the high cost of energy, people were literally dying in their homes because they could not afford to turn on the heating. That was such a scandalous thing, they introduced this allowance. In comes the Labour government, supposedly the government of work for the workers, and eliminates the allowance. That massively hit the popularity of the Labour, because they said you're hitting the most vulnerable. Now they're attacking the disabled and many others. They're absolutely hated now by a big layer of the people, and a lot of people are saying they're just the same. We've had similar developments in Germany, where the traditional parties, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, have declined, and you have the AfD, which is creating the popularity of the AfD on the right. In Britain, it's Farage that's growing. In France, it's Le Pen. And you notice it with Le Pen, they've taken her to court over, in effect, a technicality, and they've sentenced her so that she cannot stand in the elections. The liberal bourgeois are desperate to hold on to power because they're becoming extremely unpopular, and they're worried about this phenomenon of this, let's call it the populist right, which is rising everywhere. The elections in Portugal recently confirmed a similar process. I think you understand the phenomenon because it's similar to here. There's a significant working class vote in this phenomenon. When you have somebody like Farage, who he's clearly on the right, he's a stockbroker, he's a bourgeois, but he's the only one that talks about nationalizations. He talks about nationalizing steel. He talks about nationalizing the water companies, which were privatized because they're in such a mess. Now, why are they talking like that? Why are they talking about the conditions of ordinary working people? They're trying to win a layer of the working class by promising that they will put an end to all the austerity. Now, the fact is, of course, they can't, and they will be tested once in government. That will prepare a new situation where the working class will look for answers elsewhere. That's how we view it. The desperate right, left, the reformists, the liberals, they see this as the end of democracy and the beginnings of fascism and all the rest of it, which is absolute nonsense. What's being prepared is not a shift to the right. It's not fascism. It's a massive wave of class struggle. We're at the beginning, not at the end. This is something we need to keep in mind. What's the stage of the class struggle we're in? We're not in a stage where the class struggle has been crushed and destroyed. It has hardly begun. We're seeing some signs of it in some countries. We had a taste of it in France when Macron introduced an increase in the age of retirement. You remember that incredible movement of the French working class. And I remember at the time, the opinion polls showed that 75% of the people in France were against that reform. And that would open up the question, how come 75% are against when Macron won the elections? Well, they ignore that Macron won in the same way that Starmer won. Macron in the first round got 24%. He didn't get a majority. 75% didn't vote for him. So it's not surprising that when he tries to attack the pensions, 75% are against him, and the working class massively mobilizes. The perspective is one of growing class struggle. After a long period of decline in the levels of strike activity, if you look at all the major countries, we are looking at a revival of the class struggle. The perspective that if we want to look at a period of history that can help us understand today, it is, you could say, the late 60s. That moment just before the massive explosion in France of May 68, the huge wave of strikes that began in Italy in the fall of 69. I've got to translate for you guys. The same was the case in the States even, and in Britain. It was a worldwide wave of class struggle that lasted for several years. That's the perspective ahead of us. At the moment, people are looking for their answers by voting these populists, who they hope, against hope, will do something for them. They'll bring down the inflation, they'll stop all these attacks. But we know that what determines the program, even of these populists, is the needs of capitalism, which are massive cuts in social spending and a massive attack on the working class. So they will see the results of this rise of this right-wing populism, and that will prepare a major wave of class struggle. On the question of, just on China, I forgot to mention some figures, just to give you an indication of how powerful China has become, and has become a major factor in world events. In the 1980s, China's global share of global GDP, that is in 1987, was 1.9%. It was less than 2%. It was an insignificant part of the world economy. In 2024, it was 19.6%. It's grown by 10 times. And now it is a major factor in the world economy. And it's vying with the US for domination of the world markets. There's an interesting article from the New York Times in early April. It talks about the tsunami that is coming from China. And it talks about China's investments and advances in manufacturing are producing a wave of exports that threatens to cause factory closings and layoffs, not just in the United States, but around the globe. The tsunami is coming for everyone. And then it says China's factory output is bigger than the combined manufacturing of the US, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Britain. That is of extreme concern for the bourgeois of the West, and in particular of the US, which explains the foreign policies, it explains what is happening. With the rise of economic power also comes military power. That's always been the case in history. Germany grew as an economic power in the 19th century and eventually became also a major power together with Britain, and we saw where that went. China now has, in terms of active military personnel, the biggest army in the world, 2.2 million soldiers. In terms of nuclear power, Russia has emerged as a major power. It's the biggest nuclear power on the planet. which determines also the way you behave towards such a country. When they have actually more nuclear warheads than the US, so there's a balance between the two. Something else that we have to look at in the new situation is it's not just the rise of the different powers which will determine the struggle globally, but there's an important actor in this scenario, which is the working class itself. I wrote an article a couple of years ago on has the working class disappeared or does it still exist? The reason for that was to bring out the real situation, because I got on my shelves these books that all talk about how the working class has disappeared, it no longer exists. And I always say, when I wake up in the morning and I make my porridge and take my spoon out of the drawer, I wonder, who made this? Who made all this? If the working class no longer exists, has the bourgeoisie become a class that not only invests in the economy, but actually does the work itself? That's absolute nonsense. In the post-war period, Ted Grant wrote an article on Will There Be a Slump? He explained that there was one positive element in that post-war boom. I mean, from a political point of view, it stabilized the system. It meant the prospect of revolution had been pushed back. There was a relative peace between the classes. But there was one positive element, which was the enormous strengthening of the working class. The development of the economy, the development of industry means you need more workers. That means the relative weight, the specific weight of the working class increases. And if you look at the figures, I mean, today we have a workforce globally of 3.6 billion. If you add their children, the older people who don't work, their partners that are not working, those that cannot work, etc., the working class is the biggest it's ever been in history, and it is a majority of the population. That poses a big problem for the ruling class. How do you govern capitalist society today with such a powerful working class, with such huge urbanization, such concentrations of workers? One little detail, going back in history. When they built the big Fiat plant in Turin in the 30s, which had about 20,000 workers, Mussolini went to speak at this factory. He didn't like what he received because he didn't get the applause he was expecting, but that's a different story. It was an indication of what was coming. But he did actually personally express concern at a concentration of so many workers in one factory, which shows that he wasn't that stupid. He knew the power of the working class. The concentration of the growth of the working class globally now does mean that the way the bourgeois governs, the way it maneuvers, is different from the past. They've got to try and it actually explains Trump, Farage, and the others. Why is it they have to go into all this rhetoric about the workers and bringing back the jobs? It's because they realize that there is such a huge part of the population is now the proletariat. They have to govern over that and govern it in such a way that they can increase their profit, maximize their profits, cut into workers' living standards, and at the same time avoid revolution. That's one hell of a task they've got facing them. As I said, they got the American Pope hopefully trying to help them in that. But what is the program? This is the point. What is the program of the ruling class globally? They have to cut the debt. There was a really good article on Marxist.com on this the other day. The huge growth of the debt means they have no other option but to attack and try and cut it. At the same time, they've got to cut the cost of labor in each country if they're going to be competitive. They've got to privatize what's left. It's a program of war against the working class. The problem is this. You provoke this working class to mobilize. Once it starts to mobilize, it will discover actually how powerful it is. Look at Serbia. I think it's worth looking at the Serbian situation. Here we have, like in all countries, a trade union leadership completely, out of touch with the mood of the working class, a trade union leadership whose only aim is to pacify and calm the working class and maintain relations between the classes, and yet you see this mobilization of it's almost practically the whole population on the streets, 80% of them supporting the students. It really brings home what kind of movements we will see in the future. And you can imagine when it's not the Serbian working class, which is obviously a small country, or what we saw in Greece, but can you imagine that kind of movement erupting in a Germany or a France with its traditions, or the United States? How do you govern over that? The potential for revolution is everywhere, and what the working class have suffered, and it means the class has been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. You can only squeeze so far before there is a major reaction of the working class. And as I said, the Farage-type phenomenon, Trump, AFD, etc., it is only an indication of one phase of the class struggle that's developing, and it's preparing a turn in the situation. On top of this, we have this tariff war, which is also an indication of what I said before. When the world market is not big enough for everybody, the only way one capitalist power can increase its share, can increase its profits, its extraction of surplus value, is at the expense of others. When the pie is growing for everybody, it doesn't matter if your share is smaller, it's still getting bigger. When the pie stops growing, the only way you can get a bigger slice is by making the slice smaller for the others. That is what the tariff wars express. The only problem, of course, is that the last time this was done, it provoked the depression of the 1930s. That is what they are extremely concerned about. And the fact that a major power turns to using these measures, these protectionist measures, is an indication of its weakness, not of its strength. It's using one element. There's one strong element. It's the biggest market in the world, of course. And they're saying, you want to sell here? Well, you got to pay. The problem with that is, of course, it's destabilizing the whole of the world economy. But just to give some figures of the potential damage of a tariff war, I'm quoting here from a European Union report. The transatlantic trade relationship is the most important commercial relationship in the world. EU-US trade in goods and services reached an impressive $1.6 trillion in 2023. This means that every day, $4.4 billion worth of goods and services cross the Atlantic between the EU and the US. But furthermore, US exports of goods and services to the EU support 2.3 million jobs in the US. And EU firms' investments in the US employ 3.4 million people. There's other figures for the jobs in Europe. A massive trade war between these two powers will lead to massive cuts in jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. That would be the effect. Plus the inflationary effects of the tariffs. It will have exactly the opposite of what the workers who vote for these people are hoping for. That actually explains the zigzags in the policy. One day it's 145%, next day it's a deal back down to 30%, some countries it's 10%. It's a realization, and there's the pressure there from the bourgeois themselves, that if you go down this road all the way, you're looking at a major economic world downturn, and that prepares the class struggle across the world. Very, very briefly, it's in this situation that we see conflicts like India-Pakistan, which also reflects the interests of the bourgeoisie locally. It's also reflected in the war in the Ukraine, Russia versus the West. These are all indirect expressions of the conflicts between the powers for spheres of influence, which at the end of the day means access to markets and profitability. And in the Middle East, we have one of the most barbaric expressions of this, which is the power of the Zionist bourgeois, the ruling class, trying to expand historically into the territories of the Palestinians. They're carrying on with a project they started many decades ago. And the last item of news is the new 22 settlements that they're going to build. They're further encroaching, and they're literally starving a whole people to death. And even there, you see the conflicts, how this could destabilize the Middle East. If this were to lead to a war with Iran, for example, it would destabilize the Middle East, and it would have a major impact on the world economy, being that it's a source of oil. And that explains also why, even there, you see the conflict between Trump and Netanyahu on how to proceed. I have other things that I could have said, but I'll just bring to my concluding remarks. What I said about the size of the working class itself is an important element. And as I said before, history has lots of lessons, but we've never seen a world capitalism with this size working class, which determines also our understanding of how the class struggle can pan out. Now, at the moment, the process is one where, politically speaking, in the advanced capitalist countries, we have this swing towards these so-called populist, they refer to them as far right, but it's not a very scientific term, because what is included in the far right can be even the small little fascist organizations such as the English Defence League. It's a new phenomenon, in effect. There are similarities with the past, but there's also new elements within it. Now, they're riding high. They are going to be put to the test once in government. Big hopes are being placed in them, and at the same time, that means big disappointment is going to come, and that is going to prepare a swing to the left. We have certain signs of that. The comrade referred to Germany. You saw what happened in Germany. Germany shows you the potential for a development also on the left. Because in Germany, although it's not a revolutionary party, Die Linke in the election campaign did stand on social issues. For example, the question of rent. I think in America, if a party stood and put as its central demand a maximum rent of something like, no more than 30% of your wages, I think every young person in America would vote for them. And it's the same in other countries. And that was shown in the massive growth in its votes, but particularly amongst the youth. The AfD grew on the right, but Die Linke, amongst the youth under the age of 25, got 25%. And significantly, amongst women under the age of 25, they got 34%. It shows you the huge potential actually on the left, where there is something that somehow offers itself as an alternative. Of course, what happened to Die Linke when they elected Merz is they offered to help him in parliament by providing the votes. It shows you the weakness of the reformists. Even when they managed to succeed to move forward electorally, they very quickly throw it away by falling for the idea of lesser evilism, i.e., we've got to have Merz, otherwise we open the door to the AfD. What they don't understand is by behaving like this, you're actually strengthening the right. You're not weakening it. That's one of the main messages we've got to get across, actually, as revolutionary communists. A lot of people on the left will look at us as sectarians. We're breaking the unity. We're not for a united front. We say, yes, we're for a united front of the workers' organizations, but not with the liberal bourgeois in the name of fighting this so-called fascism, because you actually are strengthening them. So we actually have a very powerful message to take out there, comrades, and that's why we need to build this organization in all the countries we're in, spread to countries where we don't exist, strengthen ourselves, particularly in a country like the United States, because what's coming is a big period in history of class struggle, and it's basically our period has opened up. We just have to build and be prepared to play the role that's necessary.